I must have started reading at home because I went to school when I was 4. A lot of people did in the Second World War. I was born in 1939, and they sent you to school a year earlier so that your mother, being your father was away, if your father was away in the war, could go out and work, part of the war effort. So when I got to school, I could read. And there weren't books abounding, not at all, but there was a library in the yard in which we lived. We were a council house yard, and in the corner was a library. There was also a fire station and a horse box and all sorts of other things. So I went there twice a week, and the man in charge was very nice, and he changed the books for me until I got the hang of doing it myself. So there are plenty of books around, except they didn't belong to us. We'd take them back and so on. And I think one of the things I discovered is that if I was reading a book, 2 things happened. First of all, people left me alone. It was a busy house, about 2.5 families there. There were men coming in off shifts and back onto shifts and busying around, but they'd leave you alone if you're curled up in a chair in a corner. And I quite like being left alone. And secondly, it just completely took me over. And I began to, very early on, remember that I became other people. It was a takeover bid. I remember reading The Adventures of Robin Hood in fairly big print when I was very young. And you became Robin Hood and Little John and Will Scarlet, and you hated the Sheriff of Nottingham, and you really were completely taken up in it. And book after book that I read took me there. And I think it's in my case, and I would guess it is the same for thousands, tens of thousands, millions of other people, that the idea of leading other people's lives with impunity, enjoying being other people, is something, I suppose the word profound springs to mind, but it might seem to be rather natural, really. You want to be lots of people, and the little clock in your head saying, you've only got this one life, mate, and you've got all these other lives that you can inhabit, take over. They can inhabit you. I got serious about reading when I was about 8. We moved into a pub, and it was a beer house, really. And there was a very small flat upstairs above the pub. And I was on my own there a lot because the pubs in those days were open 365 days a year, and my mother and father ran it downstairs, and I was upstairs. And my eyesight started to go when I was about 8, and it was quite a rough environment. It wasn't tough, and it wasn't knives, and it wasn't any of that stuff. But it was rough in the 40s. It was the idea of war, the idea of boxing was very important to this country, and clubs. You did boxing at school. We went to a normal national school, but fighting was all over the place. You did that, and you're often asking for a fight, and it was bare fist fighting. And it might sound as it were I'm talking about gypsies in the Victorian age, but I'm not. That was going on a lot of the time. There was fighting in pubs on Saturday nights, and there's a lot of sport, a lot of bustling sport, rugby and football and men's sport, but it was tended to be quite rough. And I enjoyed all that. Then this eyesight thing started to perturb me, and I couldn't see the blackboard. And the teacher brought me to the front of the class rather impatiently. And then they realized something was wrong. So I had my eyes tested, and they'd gone. My eyesight was quite bad. So I had to wear specs, which actually did change your character, made you change your character. Suddenly, instead of being this person who had a gang and ranged along and broke up wasps' nests and climbed trees and that, I had these goggles on, these goggles on. And one of the things that they enabled me to do was to read more and read faster. So I read and read, and it became a complete addiction. The sense I couldn't pass any print without reading it. I mean, something on a sauce bottle, or if you passed a shop and there was books in the window, you'd read all the titles of the books. Or if you went shopping up to get a paper at the paper shop, you'd read as much of the papers as you could before you took them back. And it just became a complete addiction. And then there were some very good comics at the time, print comics. I mean, there was a Dandy and Beano, and they weren't much good. It took you about 2 minutes to flick through the words, and pictures weren't all that. Except for Desperate Dan, that was a good He looked good, Desperate Dan. Lord Snooty looked okay, but Desperate Dan was the man. Then you got the real comics, the Wizard, the Rover, the Hotspur, the Adventure, Champion. Those are small print, real short stories, really, about 4 or 5 in each comic. Well developed, I think. Characters I can remember now. Alf Tupper, Tough of the Track. Nick Smith of the Rovers. Sergeant Braddock in the Air Force. I mean, how many? Baldy Hogan, another footballer. How many people can you remember from literature as easily as I can summon all these people to mind? You reread things that you skimmed. The first 2 or 3 volumes of Proust, for instance, and you reread them, and then you keep going, and you realise that what's happened is that you've got a lot older, and so you can understand a lot more, and the book's reading you in that sense. And the first time it read you, it didn't find you really up to it. I used to read a lot of plays. I heard plays on the radio, and when I went to university, you could buy them in Oxfam shop. You could buy them very, very cheaply, these plays. And I read enormous, and I just couldn't understand how Chekhov did it. He moved so fast from one thing to another. I mean, rather like Shakespeare in that sense. You just, 4 pages into reading Shakespeare, so much has happened, and you go back, how did you do that? Well, we got to there, we started there, and the speed of it was one thing that impressed me, and then, of course, the intensity and the deposit at the end of it, what Chekhov leaves you with. It leaves you with such a complication, still does now. I don't know what you think about this. When anybody says what your 6 favourite films, there is a serious moment where I can't remember that I've ever seen a single film. Yeah. You just go on, what do you mean 6 favourite films? Are you talking? There's no such thing as 6 favourite films. Like Borges said, there's no such thing about reading a masterpiece once. You just think there's no such thing as 6 favourite films. You used to think when you were young, experience was what you did, and you used to read avidly the back of books when you'd read them. He worked on a ship, and then he was a cook in Paris, and then he did 17 different things. You think, God, that's a life of experience. What the hell have I done? And that sort of thing. But even if he did, generally Americans who did these things, good for them, it's just a tiny part of your experience. You realise that your experience is everything that happens to you all of the time. Your experience is other people's experiences. Your experience is what's happened in the books. Your experience is what you've seen on the screen. Your experience is what you can remember. So your experience is this vast, and that's even before you begin to think of what you make up and misremember in imagination and misremembering. So your experience is oceanic. And so the idea of plucking into that and saying, that little plankton did it, is absurd, really. You don't know what really clicked you on. Orwell got somewhere thinking about that when he's writing about the comics. And there's something in that, I think. There's something that, who knows which way you go. Are you reading that because it makes you laugh? And you think, oh, and you go deeper and deeper. I mean, one of the books I remember extremely clearly and thinking, I used to read it in the section called School Books in the town library, which was books about boys at public school, basically. And I just loved them. And there was one called Mike, which is in school books. So I read this Mike. And I thought it was, and I must have been, I can't remember. Let's make it up, 10, something like that. But it was just another school book. It was, in a school, he was a very good cricketer, and his brother was a better cricketer. And this chap Smith turned up, and it was by Wodehouse. And I read it again and again. And now that was an accidental influence, not, alas, making me to a comic writer of any sort, but getting me more and more interested in the way things were done and the way they're made, I suppose. I suppose I learned about plotting and that there. That's a very laborious way of saying you don't know what influences. That's why I insist on saying maybe these comics were a big influence, not just on me, but on lots of other people. I mean, we just did a program on George R. R. Martin, the Game of Thrones man. Well, he's very open about the fact that it was comic books and and these picture books that got him going. He started to write to imitate them. I think it's very honest of him. I think a lot of us are. I think maybe you're influenced by letting yourself be taken over. Because writing solitary, it's solitude without loneliness. And for a lot of people, I like to be solitary half the time. The other time, I like to work in a gang. But if you're writing, you're not lonely. You are solitary, though. And I like being solitary. Maybe it's that sense of that's the way I want to live my life. A lot of people feel that I want that. But I don't just want to sit in a corner and be the lonely old guy in the corner. Well, I can't let myself be that, so I do something else. And in my case, it's read and write.